Good morning or good evening, wherever you may be watching from. Today I would like to give a little bit of a progress update on the Ukrainian offensive, how that is going. Talk a little bit about NATO and what might be coming in the Vilnius Summit just week after next. But first I'd like to just cover a little bit about what seems to be happening in France at the moment, as I think this is an interesting contrast to what the Western media has been suggesting or should have been happening in Moscow after Prigozhin's insurrection last week. Anyhow, so if you have been watching the news in the last few days, over about the last 5 or 6 days, you'll know that riots have started again across France. This has been triggered by the police shooting of a 17-year-old boy, Nahel M. There's video footage of this. He appears to have been stopped in a roadside stop by 2 gendarmes, and while you can't see or hear exactly what has happened, as he attempts to drive off, it appears that one of the police officers shoots him and kills him. This has been the flashpoint to trigger the recent round of violent riots in France. Now, this was in the region of Nanterre in Paris. And while there is widespread rioting occurring in Paris, it has spread across the country. Interestingly, I have seen some maps showing where there are riots in France at the moment, and it resembles or even outweighs the maps that you see from the likes of Rybar and Live UA showing where fighting is occurring in Ukraine at the moment. The rioting is widespread. Again, very interestingly, if you look on traditional mainstream media, there is very little being mentioned about what's happening in France. However, if you do go to social media channels, Telegram and Twitter, you will find that there is quite a lot of video footage coming out. Now, the rioting has been ongoing for about 5 days now, and it has been quite violent. I've seen some quite horrendous footage of allegedly a Parisian resident who was attempting to protect his car from being attacked and smashed and looted, and was left with one hand amputated and badly smashed arms and limbs by the crowd of rioters. There's video footage coming out of rioters with sniper rifles. There's footage of what appears to perhaps be like a rocket-propelled grenade having been launched at a police station. Reports of an armory, a gun shop being looted, and multiple videos of just shops and malls being broken into, cars, trucks being driven through, and people just looting everywhere. I saw some footage earlier this morning of a street I presume in Paris somewhere, with a row of cars, 7 or 8 cars along, just parked nose to tail along the street, all of them burnt out. The level of rioting is very high. So I suggest, if you haven't seen this on your local newspaper, then go to Twitter and search French riots or France riots, or get yourself Telegram and search there, and you may get a wider view on what's happening there. Interestingly, the French President Emmanuel Macron, his initial response to this in a televised interview was that the causes for this were things like video games and bad parenting. And in a scene that resembles the story of Nero fiddling while Rome burns, while the third night of the rioting was occurring, Macron was out at an Elton John concert, seemingly enjoying himself there. So while the shooting of this teenage boy has been the flashpoint to trigger the rioting, this is sitting on a background of two other large concerns for the French public. One of them has been a pension reform bill that caused there to be protest, although sort of non-violent protests, a couple of weeks ago. But this is a bill that would see the age of the pension being raised from 62 to 64. This will, of course, be due to the fact that France, like many other countries, has got an ageing population. The government who funds these retirement funds will obviously be seeing that they're going to struggle to be able to pay for that, and so they're looking to push the age up to reduce the financial burden on them to provide that. This is common in any country that has a social security or retirement plan and retirement policy for its constituents, where as the population ages, these things become unsupportable. Where you have, you end up an aging population with the bulk of your population or a greater percentage of it now at the age of 60 or 65, expecting to retire at that age and no longer generate income and contribute to the economy, and expecting the government to pay them a pension and wage. The simple mathematics of that is that burden on the government grows. The government needs to get its money from taxation because the government doesn't produce any money itself. And it has a smaller population upon which it can tax, and so it becomes politically suicidal to say, oh, we will increase taxes because you've now got a smaller group of people having to pay those taxes who obviously then won't vote for you. So the government's in a position where they need to then raise the age at which they will agree to pay pensions. So that's one of the factors building this pressure, this social pressure, and leading to protests and riots. The other one is the issue of immigration. So immigration has been a huge issue for France and for other European nations for a long time. And France is caught in a position where they rely heavily upon immigrants to supplement the workforce. They have a large number of undocumented workers. Obviously, France being part of the EU, which has its borderless travel policy, allows people to travel from France to other nations and vice versa in Europe, those members of the EU. But it also means that if migrants are able to enter EU states via some other country, then they can find it relatively easy to travel up to and into France. So the more national elements of the French population, the more right wing, as you would classify them, wish to clamp down and strengthen the immigration policies, wanting to put in place policies where they will look for educated or people who have particular skills and provide them with access and allow them into the country, and deny others who don't have those skills to support the country, because again they see them as being a burden upon the country if they come in and are able to start then claiming social services and what have you. It's an age-old debate, this one. There's also then challenges on the other side where the Macron's new bill is proposing to what they term regulise undocumented migrants. So in this case, they would take someone who's undocumented, but if they can get them to agree to go and work in a sector of the economy where they need migrant labour, they can then sort of speed up their process of becoming documented and gaining residency within France. Now, France wants to do this and needs to do this because the economy relies upon the cheap labour that they get from these undocumented migrants. So there's conflicts here. Macron's perhaps primary opponent, political opponent, Marine Le Pen, She's the head of the right wing group, the National Rally group. She's come out and said that the proposed law will have a pull effect and bring a new wave of undocumented migrants to France. Now, this all also plays into what's happening at the moment with this rioting, where reportedly large numbers of the people involved in the rioting are coming from the undocumented migrant community. So you can see how France is caught in a position here where they want the migrants because they provide them with cheap labour, which they need. On the other hand, they seem to be involved in the rioting, which is going on and causing a problem. And this will have a huge impact on France. And this is why it's being kept so quiet by the Western media, is because France is obviously a large tourist destination. Now, at the moment, with the streets in Paris being shut down, with rioting going on, with 40,000 riot police being activated by Macron across the country, you can see that people will be starting to think twice about taking their children to Paris this summer. They might choose to go somewhere else. So yeah, and interesting for Macron in May of this year, May of 2023, his popularity sank to its lowest point ever, where he has just over a quarter of the population giving him, indicating they approve of his presidency at about 27%, and a 70% disapproval rating. He remains in power until 2027, when the next French presidential election will occur. However, last June 2022, he lost his parliamentary majority through elections that occurred then, and that's sort of hampering him, putting him in some respects in what the Americans would call a lame duck presidency, where without a majority he's unable to move through bills, and things end up just circling around, and he doesn't have the majority to be able to get them approved and pushed through. So while the Western media still now is drumming up stories about Putin being on the edge of being toppled and civil war in Russia, in reality, it seems that right now Moscow is very stable, Russia is stable. Reports have come out that the uprising led by Yevgeny Prigozhin has in fact strengthened Putin's position within the nation, and that his support has risen. People internally feel that he handled it very well, that there wasn't a great overreaction, that a lot of people felt that, yes, while they were aware of it, there was never any real concern or risk. Oppose this with France at the moment, where there have been 5 nights and days of looting, violent rioting. It certainly appears that France is the country closer to civil war at the moment than Russia is. Okay, so there's a little bit of France. I might do a whole thing on this in the next couple of days, because I don't think it's going away in a hurry. But moving back to Ukraine, the Antonovsky Bridge in the Kherson region. Now, this bridge was destroyed last year by the Russians after they had made their withdrawal from the Kherson region back over from the western side of Kherson into the eastern side. Some of the reasons posited at that time for why the Russians were withdrawing from Kherson were that they had concern that the Novkhovka dam might be destroyed, as has happened, and that they would then have their troops isolated on the western side. Anyhow, they destroyed that bridge after their withdrawal. Now, in the last week, the Ukrainian forces have used what appears to have perhaps been a sort of slightly repaired barge bridge and motorboats to deploy Ukrainian forces underneath the eastern side of the Antonovsky Bridge, where there were some spans still standing over the land before it reached the water. The Ukrainians had allegedly deployed up to 50, maybe 100 forces there, and they were starting to spread out to some of the local duckers and a hotel that was there, and that they had mined the approach road using their, I believe it would probably have been using the forward and advanced mining techniques, where they can actually fire out a shell And that shell will then do an airburst and deploy mines, so they don't have to be right where they are mining. There was video footage yesterday of a Russian, or actually I think a Chinese, it might have been, is it a Chinese Tiger, which is supplied to the Russians, armoured vehicle, which had encountered a mine and was destroyed on the start of that approach road. The approach road is a long, straight, couple of kilometre long road which drives right up to the bridge. So yes, the Ukrainians had established a bridgehead there and were starting to expand it. There was some Russian fighting, although the Russian positions in that area had been decreased due to the flooding that had occurred when the Antonovsky Bridge, I keep saying bridge, dam was destroyed. However, yesterday a Iskander missile strike was called in on the span of the bridge where it was believed the Ukrainian forces were basing themselves, and reports subsequent to that indicated that Russian special military forces also utilized speedboats to approach from behind after the missile strike, and that they were able to neutralize and remove the Ukrainian forces from that bridgehead. That was last night. This morning, I have heard some additional reporting that a number of reinforcements or new troops have been sent by the Ukrainians back into that bridgehead area. So it appears as though some small level of fighting is still ongoing there. Although the real purpose and strategic or even tactical goals of the Ukrainians in this case are not clear to understand, as they don't have the bridge intact behind them to allow them to reinforce. So they would need to find means of amphibiously bringing across any heavy equipment. Clearly, we can see that Russian artillery is able to hit them, and Russians are prepared to use missile strikes if required to stop this. So anyone going into that region, I think, would be going into a very high risk environment, and would know that they were walking into quite likely the last fight of their life, crossing that water. But still, those forces appear in small numbers to being reinforced. Some people think that this is due to the fact that at the NATO Vilnius Summit coming up on the 11th and 12th of July, that Ukraine wished to be able to claim some successes, and being able to claim that they had established a bridgehead here would provide a story to tell. If they have been blasted back out of this region, they would lack the ability to tell that story. So that might be why we're seeing small numbers being sent over there, and that may be the purpose behind it. Now, one story that just seems to not die, we can't quite get away from yet, is Wagner Group and Yevgeny Prigozhin. There's still many interesting threads running from this. So, while Prigozhin himself has apparently been exiled to Belarus, his troops, some of them, those that didn't follow him on the incursion into Russia and towards Moscow, appear to have returned to their bases and fighting in the Donbass. However, there are reports that in Belarus, an area, an encampment has been set up, and that in the last day or so, it's been reported that 250 tents have appeared there, and so it's believed that perhaps the 8,000 troops that did support him are moving there to Belarus. I have heard talk that there may actually be 3 Wagner camps being established with accommodation for up to 24,000 troops. This seems to have caused some responses from Lithuania and Latvia, in terms of them talking about now the need for NATO to help them strengthen their borders, because there are Wagner forces close by in Belarus. Latvia, I've seen in a report today, has commenced its first ever general mobilisation of troops. There's footage there of young young men, but boys, teenagers, young men in their 20s with backpacks and shorts, lining up and signing up and being conscripted to form forces which will be on the border of Belarus. Information around the future of Russian senior military people such as Sergey Shoigu, the Minister of Defense, and the Commander-in-Chief of the Aerospace Forces and Deputy Commander in Ukraine, Sergey Surovikin. It seems as though the media focus has moved from Shoigu to Surovikin, where in the last week there were many reports that Shoigu is going to be ousted, and this may even have happened. Now, Shoigu has turned up and been seen on video, and there has been no reports whatsoever of him being ousted. So the media reporting seems to have moved to Surovikin, that Surovikin may have been an inside supporter of Prigozhin and Wagner, and that he's been arrested. However, I have heard reports that Dmitry Peskov has stated that this is not the case, and Surovikin's daughter was interviewed on a Russian radio station yesterday, where she has stated that no, her father's still working, he's not been arrested. So again, this feels as though this is Western propaganda trying to keep the story alive that the Prigozhin event has caused great problems and weakened Putin. However, in reality, it seems as though it may have had the reverse effect, and that Putin has come out of it stronger at least internally in Russia, and being seen that way. One thing that has sort of stuck in my mind the whole way through, I've mentioned this a couple of times, and I was talking to someone about this the other night, and both of us felt that one interesting fact is that if this was a real coup attempt, why Prigozhin was allowed to go to Belarus, apparently without real punishment, without imprisonment, without a court case for treason. And why in Putin's speech to the public just after the events had started to settle down that he didn't mention Prigozhin by name. An interesting article I saw today where the imprisoned Russian opposition leader Alexi Navalny, who has been imprisoned for some time now for fraud charges where he allegedly embezzled funds given to his anti-corruption group and used them for purposes that shouldn't have been used. And he's been a strong critic of Putin since 2010, 2011. But he has come out and said, why is he imprisoned and not Prigozhin? And again, I think it's good. That's a good point. I think there's very different reasons for Navalny being imprisoned. He's got strong Western backing. You can understand why Putin would just not want him on the scene at all, given his Western connections. And after what Putin has seen happen in Ukraine in 2014 and things like that, with the coup there, organised by Victoria Nuland and the US. But it is good. It's a good question because, again, it leads me to feel that Prigozhin's flare-up wasn't a real coup attempt, and that Putin's aware of that. And actually, when speaking to my friend the other night, I was reminded of the fact that there was allegedly a meeting of Putin and Prigozhin in Moscow only in the week before the incursion into Rostov-on-Don occurred. And as I recall, what I saw of the reporting of that was that Prigozhin came out of the meeting happy. It was reportedly a good meeting between the two. So it does lead me to think that Putin was aware of what was going on, that he wasn't really concerned about it, and that may have guided his response to this. It didn't need to be a stern response because he knew it was not a real coup attempt. Perhaps it did give him and the Ministry of Defence some time to think about, well, if we let the Wagner forces travel north towards Moscow, it might be a way of us in plain sight getting them to Belarus quickly. There certainly has been response, as I said before, from the Latvians, the Lithuanians and the Polish, claiming that they now need NATO support and to put troops into their countries to allow them to counteract the threat that they see of the Wagner forces now being there. Anyhow, interesting to see. Well, I'm sure we'll learn more in time. The Chernigov region. This is an area just northeast of Kiev and south of the Belarusian border. Earlier in May, there were a series of missile and bombing strikes into Chernigov. And I remember reporters at the time who were following this conflict stating that they were unaware of why this would be happening, what was going on there. They couldn't seem to think of what real military strategic importance the Chernigov region would have. Anyhow, this might be an area to keep an eye on, as a general mobilisation has just been announced in the Chernigov region. So it has extended across almost all of Ukraine now, but it's been announced there. And an uncorroborated report that I saw yesterday is indicating that some of the Wagner forces have actually been deployed to this Chernigov region. So I don't know what is going on there, but it does seem as though there's some intensification of activity and heating up of actions there, with perhaps Wagner troops being deployed to that region. As we know, the Wagner troops are seasoned combat professionals, so if they are being deployed there, then the indication would be that there is going to be some fight occurring there in the near future. Robotny, in the Zaporozhye region, there have been reports of a push there towards Tokmak. I'm seeing conflicting reports afterwards. I saw this last night. Early today, I'm seeing ones indicating this may not be the case. There has been a lot of talk on social media that Ukrainians are making advances everywhere. There does not seem to have been the same reports from the Russian channels that they've seen this. And now the Russian channels often will report when there is an advance. They'll report quite often they're receiving heavy pressure, advances are being made, ground may be being taken. But in this case, they don't seem to be giving a great deal of information supporting anything getting down towards Tokmak. So again, there seems to be a large media and PR push from the Ukrainians at the moment in claiming that there are advances being made all across the line. Now, I'm sure there are all the time small advances being made, but many of these are also immediately repelled and pushed back, and no strategic capture of land is occurring after 3 weeks now of this, well, even more, about 4 weeks now of this offensive. I think we have to say that this offensive really has failed. It's certainly not achieved what would have been expected from 4 weeks of offensive now. Simplicius the Thinker, in another one of his great articles, talks now that there have allegedly been secret reports led by Kiev in late June, and that those talks have involved representatives from Kiev and from leaders of the BRICS nations, apparently talking to the BRICS leaders, some South Africans and Brazilians perhaps, to try to get them to convince the Russians to come to the negotiating table. Obviously, the offensive was to try to achieve ground, like a breakthrough to cut off Crimea, to get down through Tokmak to Melitopol to the Sea of Azov, cut off Crimea, and then say to the Russians, okay, now that we've got Crimea back, let's meet and discuss and negotiate peace. And they would have been in a position to bargain and leverage this. Now, the Russians, I don't think we're ever going to play along with that. They've heavily reinforced the area. One must remember that any Ukrainian advances that are spoken about now must be put in the context that they are only advances into what was previously known as the grey zone, a contested area between the Russian lines and the Ukrainian lines. There have been no Ukrainian advances made that have made it past the grey zone and onto any of the areas that are well defended by the Russians. The Ukrainians are fighting at the moment through what the Russians consider to be a grey zone or a crumple zone, where they expect to be able to just fall back until they get to their really fortified positions. So the fortified positions, which have been talked about for months now, and which the Russians have had months and months to build, have not been reached. So the Ukrainians are realizing now that they're in a position where they have not achieved any leverage to be able to force the Russians to sit down and negotiate. The Russians aren't planning on sitting down and negotiating. The Russians are more of the mind to think that they will let the Ukrainians grind themselves on this grey zone, build up their forces through what they're calling their silent or invisible mobilization, where the Russian Ministry of Defense is claiming that they are receiving 10,000 or more volunteers per week signing up. So the Russians are indicating they don't need to have a formal mobilization when they're getting that many of volunteers. So the Russians can just build up forces, slowly attrit the Ukrainian forces, and then choose when they wish to, perhaps, to slowly move forward. So this does seem to give weight to the fact that perhaps there has been this secret meeting in Kiev where they're starting to realize that they need to find some way to get out of what's happening at the moment. And now, I'm not just saying this because the Russians are indicating they're feeling comfortable with what's going on, but there was an interview with the Washington Post where the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, General Zaluzhny, spoke openly about his feelings of how the offensive is progressing, and he expressed real frustration about what's going on. I'll read just some of the quotes from his interview. When referring to the Ukrainian artillery, he said, "We should be firing at least as many artillery shells as the enemy, but we've been outshot tenfold at times because of limited resources." So here, this is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine clearly stating that they are outmatched 10-1 by Russian artillery. Now, anyone trying to advance with a 10-1 overmatch against artillery is going to be suffering tremendous losses. And there's a lot of propaganda out there from the West stating at the moment that the Russians are suffering very heavy losses, heavier losses than the Ukrainians are. In my own opinion, I'm just not seeing the evidence for that. And when you have the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine admitting that there's a 10-1 artillery overmatch in the Russians' advantage, you've got to start to think that those articles saying that the Russians are suffering worse losses than the Ukrainians, where's the evidence? We've got to see the evidence for that. He also complained, Zaluzhny complained, that while NATO's own doctrine would require them to have air superiority before they would start an offensive, he says Western allies expect quick successes, although they themselves would never start without air superiority. While Ukraine has not received modern fighters, the offensive has been forced to begin. So here again, he's admitting that even NATO doctrine wouldn't commence an offensive like the ones the Ukrainians have been forced into without air superiority. Now, Alexander Makuris today, I heard report that since June, the Russians have not lost a single aircraft due to Ukrainian air defences. And yet that there's been multiple reports of Ukrainian jets being shot down. So again, it's clearly obvious that the Ukrainians have entered this offensive in a position where they are likely to suffer losses, where they're outmatched, outgunned 10-1 in terms of artillery, where they don't have air superiority. And again, it's admitted by the head of the Ukrainian armed forces. He goes on to say that without being fully supplied, these plans are not feasible at all, but they are being carried out. Yes, perhaps not as fast as the participants, the observers would like, but that is their problem, he states. So real frustration. He even speaks about his relationship with Mark Milley, who's the chief of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the US, and it's interesting what he says here. He says we have an agreement, very frank conversations. 24/7 we're in touch. So sometimes I can call up and say, if I don't get 100,000 shells this week, 1,000 people will die. Step into my shoes, he says. So here, Zaluzhny is someone who there has been a lot of speculation about where he has been, as his absence from the media scene has been noted over the last few months, prior to this offensive beginning and during the offensive. And people have suggested that he was unwell, that he'd been injured or something like that. But it appears as though he has actually strongly opposed the offensive on sound military strategic basis, that he's known that they're outgunned, he's known that they don't have air superiority, and that he's known that they will suffer heavy losses. And so you're reading into what he says here in this case. Look, he's saying if he doesn't get 100 shells in a week, then 1,000 people will die. Now, there are reports that there have been days where the Ukrainians have lost upwards towards 1,000 soldiers in a day. There are reports that across the first 2 weeks of the offensive fighting, that somewhere between 13 and 15,000 Ukrainian troops would have been lost in that period of time. So I think that what Zaluzhny is doing here is confirming that the Ukrainian offensive is not going well, and that he himself didn't support the offensive commencing. I mean, his statement that without being fully supplied, these plans are not feasible at all is a very telling statement from the commander of the Ukrainian forces. So look, that's the situation there in Ukraine, I think, is starting to deteriorate in terms of the support and the offensive and the desired outcomes of the offensive. Now this puts us into a position where Zelensky has now got his military chief stating that they've got problems, big problems. They need air support. They need air superiority, and they don't have it. If they don't get the shells, that they're going to see thousands of people dying. And he's indicating that they don't have the shells, and they're outgunned 10-1. The offensive hasn't given the advances and the wins that Zelensky wanted to be able to take to the NATO Summit in Vilnius to be able to claim that, look, we're making great progress. Look what we've done with your support. We need continued support. If you give us that, we can rout the Russians out of here. He doesn't have that, and that is going to lead them into perhaps some reckless activities. So I'm going to just jump from here for a moment and just come and talk a little bit about NATO and that summit and where this might leave us if it doesn't go well for the Ukrainians. So the NATO summit in Vilnius is 11th to the 12th of July. And there are a couple of big questions to be answered. One of them is who will take over from Jens Stoltenberg as the Secretary General of NATO. His term is up. I believe he could be re-elected and could continue, as his term has been extended previously. There was talk of a UK candidate, Mark Wallace, being put into that position. However, Joe Biden resolutely denied that and said that he wouldn't accept him. The Americans obviously have a large sway in NATO. So there's that question, just to see who may take over from Stoltenberg. And the other one is, what will be the outcomes of discussions about providing Ukraine with some sort of security guarantee? It's been openly stated by members of NATO that the Ukraine won't enter NATO now, and that won't happen at this NATO summit. The normal path for Ukraine to enter NATO is something that just won't happen in the near future. And there's talk that Ukraine could enter NATO at the end of the war. Now, the Ukrainian government has been lobbying behind the scenes for some sort of a bespoke route to joining NATO. So they recognise, they understand that while the war's going on with Russia, that they won't be joining NATO via the normal membership action plan, the MAP, they call it. And that they need to find some other way. So the US appears to be trying to form some new coalition of the willing, like they did in Iraq, trying to drum up some support from some member states. This appears to perhaps be some of the Baltic states and maybe Poland, and seems to be an attempt to, because they can't get NATO as a whole to allow Ukraine in to NATO and therefore get full NATO coverage, and be able to then enact an Article 5 moment where they would say, oh, well, Ukraine as a NATO state is being attacked, therefore we can all go in and support. Instead, talk seems to be around trying to find some states who will independently say they will provide a security guarantee. Maybe Lithuania, perhaps Romania, Poland, some states like that who are bordering Ukraine, bordering Belarus, Lithuania perhaps, who could say that they independently will create a security guarantee for Ukraine, which would enable them to put their forces into Ukraine to join the battle. Now, this could be an interesting foot in the door to full NATO involvement, because if, let's say, Lithuania or Poland were to put their forces actively into Ukraine, note that there are many mercenaries from Poland already operating in the fight. There's I saw video footage yesterday of Russians finding a dead Polish mercenary, and there's been plenty of reports of Polish chatter being intercepted in the combat groups. But in this case, we'd be talking about Poland actually taking some of its battalions and brigades and sending them down into Ukraine as Polish forces. Now, the risk here is that Russia sees that and interprets that as Poland or Lithuania effectively joining the conflict, and Russia then deciding to extend its missile and bombing campaigns into Lithuania and Poland, even perhaps just to the borders on the main access routes and the train lines interconnecting the countries, to stop them supplying resources to Ukraine. And then those missile attacks against Poland or Lithuania, then invoking an Article 5 situation, and by default, NATO now gets in to support Poland or Lithuania, not Ukraine, who's not a member of NATO, but is now able to engage directly with the Russians, and all NATO states can then get involved. So this this summit coming up will be very important and very critical, could be a turning point in this conflict if it is agreed that some coalition of the willing group of states will provide security guarantees. Zelensky has reportedly been saying that he won't attend the summit unless he is given some signal that the process for Ukraine to enter NATO will commence at some stage. And look, NATO has got some internal hurdles to overcome. Turkey and Sweden, well, Sweden would like to join NATO, but Turkey is blocking that at the moment. Just this week, in what appears to have been an approved protest, a copy of the Holy Quran was burnt by a protester in Sweden. And now this is likely to stiffen Turkey's reluctance to allow Sweden to join NATO. Turkey already sees Sweden as being problematic to them because they allege that Sweden houses some of the Kurdish militants in the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, who threatened a coup against Turkey, and Turkey consider them to be terrorists. Now, Sweden denies that they're providing safe haven to them. So Sweden denies that, but that's why Turkey is one of the reasons, or at least they're given reason for why they don't want to provide access to Sweden to NATO. And Turkey obviously is strongly supportive of its Islamic community, and it has quarrelled in the past, even with people like France, states like France, over France's liberal acceptance of allowing cartoonists to produce satire of their prophet Muhammad, which Islam does not allow, and so Turkey strongly supportive of that. The burning of the Quran in Sweden is not going to help relations between them. But also, Turkey has very close ties with Russia. Turkey actually rejected the calls for a new defence strategy at last week's NATO defence ministers meeting, and that defence strategy was going to reshape the current NATO defence strategy, which has been a very defensive one, to more of an offensive strategy focused solely on Russia and how NATO would defend against, but also offensively thwart a fight just with Russia. Now, the Turkish defence minister effectively rejected that. And so, again, I think that part of their hesitancy of letting Sweden in is that they wish to maintain their good standing with Russia. Obviously, Turkey borders onto Russia. Around the Black Sea, so they want to keep this relationship good with the Russians. Turkey already has military ties, which is unusual for NATO, but has purchased an S-400 air defense system from the Russians. When they did purchase that, at that time, the US then cancelled a proposed sale of F-35 fighters to Turkey as a reprisal for them purchasing the S-400. Also, Turkey may also be just looking for some other leverage with some other geopolitical things they've got going on. So Turkey controls the access to the Black Sea through the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus. Now, these are two small straits that run through Turkish-controlled land, and without access to them, there is no marine access to the Black Sea. Now, the Black Sea obviously allows Russia and Ukraine to export their grain through there out of the Black Sea into the Baltic. The Turkish are looking to, in international documents, have those, the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, which are known as straits, renamed to the Turkish Straits. Now, they are often referred to as the Turkish Straits, but they're not formally called that. But this is something they would like to see. Turkey also has some challenges, even with Greece. There's some disputes over some of the islands which just sit off of the Turkish coast, which the Greece claim as being Greek islands, and Turkey would like to challenge that. They've also just increased their tonnage shipping fees through the Dardanelles from $4.08 up to per ton up to $4.42. So they're exerting some control over those areas. So everyone who has some reliance on the Black Sea within the NATO area has to be wary of what they do to Turkey. So that obviously they don't want something like the Turkish saying, okay, we're blocking the straits for a period of time. Look, other things that are happening around NATO at the moment is just this in the last 48 hours, the Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki he has begun discussing the NATO nuclear sharing program. So this is a program that allows the non-nuclear NATO states, those who don't have or produce their own nuclear weapons, to be able to store and house or locate nuclear tactical weapons within their borders. So American tactical nukes could be provided to Poland to be positioned there. Obviously, just recently, Russia has provided tactical nukes to Belarus to position in Belarus. But this NATO nuclear sharing program has been in play for ages, and countries like Turkey, Germany, Italy, and Belgium, who are non-nuclear states, already do house US tactical nuclear weapons. But again, this is an escalation. This is being talked up that Poland want to do this because Belarus has now got tactical nukes. And I guess adding to all of this is the fact that Wagner forces are now moving up into Belarus close to the Polish border. But all of this talk is indicating that war is good for business. German Rheinmetall, which is the large defense industry supplier, they're expecting future double-digit growth. They saw 18% growth over 2022, and primarily in the areas of ammunition production, production of Leopard tanks, and self-propelled units like the Panzerhaubitze. So the war is good for productivity there in Germany. Russian unemployment has decreased and is down to 3.2%. And I saw an article today talking about the large Russian tank manufacturing company. They're effectively closing down all other areas of operation and just moving to focus solely on tank production. So this, I imagine, is helping with the unemployment rates there. Look, overall, I think I'm going to call it there for today, but I will do another video shortly where I want to talk about, as I was hinting at before, the fact that I think Zelensky and the Ukrainians may be starting to feel the pressure and perhaps panic, and maybe beginning to consider some reckless activities. And specifically what I'm talking about is the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Look, if you've liked this one, subscribe, tell your friends, give it a like, please, and come back a little later today. I think I'll do one on just Zaporozhye, and we'll talk about what might be happening there. Thank you.